Study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for October the 21st, 2019. Let the record show that the only counselor not with us this evening is Councilwoman Davis. And she may be late, and we'll hope to see her in a little bit. We will start off our meeting with citizen comment on any agenda item. I have a sign-in list, and if when I call your name, you would please come to the podium and adjust the microphone so that it's comfortable to talk into and we can hear you clearly. And if you would give us your first name and last name, if you would spell your last name for the record, please, and give us your address, and then you may begin speaking. And we have 3 minutes per speaker, and I think, if I remember correctly, the green light starts to blink when you have 30 seconds, then the yellow light comes on, and you have 15, and when the red light starts blinking at you, please conclude your remarks. Thank you. So we'll start this evening with Al Gallo and Guy Namiach on deck.
Good evening, everyone. Albert Gallo, Gallo, and I live at 6685 West 30th Avenue, just right down the street. So I wanted to speak in regards to the short-term rentals. I live right next door to one, so I wanted to give you a little bit more of a personal experience as to what I've experienced living next to one. So when the house sold next to us from some long-time Wheat Ridge residents, Mike and Romy, they lived in Wheat Ridge for about 20 years or so. They moved and sold their home to an investor who basically converted the house into an Airbnb. At first, there was a lot of cars, a lot of people in and out of that house, a lot of strangers. He did a lot of one-night rents. And he had 3 bedrooms upstairs, so each bedroom was rented individually. So there could be 3, 4, 5, 6 cars on this little tiny street where it was almost impossible to navigate with cars on both sides of the street. Again, lots of people coming and going, a lot of strangers in the neighborhood, people walking around. We're a pretty popular street for dog walkers, going over to Stites Park, up from Pierce and Newland and so forth. He's also 420 friendly, and our houses are pretty close to each other, so we got to enjoy the 420 as well, which was always very nice in the evenings, trying to relax in the afternoons. But thank goodness we did have a chance to talk to the owner. He did settle it down a bit. He stopped renting the rooms individually, so now it's basically one family or one group of people coming in and renting the whole upper floor of the house. He has permanent renters in the basement that keep everything in check, quote unquote. But still, things do get out of hand. We do have the owner's number, and we have reached out to him late at night, sometimes 9, 10 o'clock at night, that the party's getting a little out of hand. During the summertime, they got a lot of renters coming in to rent, and they would go see concerts at Red Rocks, so they would get home at 1 or 2 in the morning, and we got to be up at 1 or 2 in the morning and hear all about the concert that they had got to experience. But looking at the big picture of Airbnbs, I know they're here. They're in Wheat Ridge. I think we all would agree with that. They're here, and they're here to stay. I mean, people are going to do it. And I do appreciate having options to do with my house if I choose, rent a room or do something with my house. I would like to keep that on the table. But there's a certain respect for the neighborhood, I think, that needs to be maintained, and I think we need to do that through some regulations. Licensing. I know Denver, I was living in Denver when they adopted their Airbnb rules. I don't know if they would all fit for little old Wheat Ridge here, but I think it's certainly something to look at, what their experiences have been and what good experiences and what bad experiences that they've had. I know for a fact one of the bad experiences that they've had has been, and something to keep in mind, renters. Are renters allowed to rent their rental home out on Airbnb, or does it have to be the primary owner of the house? I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Especially if you put some kind of residency rule that they have to live there 51% of the time. Do renters qualify for that, or does it have to be the physical owner of the house has to live there 51% of the time? And how do we prove that? I mean, we pull our voting records and see if they're registered in Wheat Ridge at that address, or how do we do that? I don't know how we do that. That's why we pay you all that money we pay you. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. Just give you some of my experience. It's some nights it's fine. some nights it's not so fine. And not knowing and having strangers in the neighborhood, I mean, we lock our front door and because there's strangers walking around. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Guy Namiach, and Mr. or Mrs. Jesse, I believe, on deck.
Guy Namiach, Nahmiach, 3650 Ward Road. So thanks for bringing this up. I think it's really timely. We need to have that conversation, and this is just kind of fact-fighting at this point. I guess my question is, what is the purpose of this? What is the purpose? Is it to turn away what we have? We have 141 Airbnbs in Wheat Ridge right now, about, plus or minus, depending on the week. So is it to turn them away? Is it to generate income? Is it to control what we have? Is it to promote full houses or rooms? We have a guy on 38 in Parfait that's renting his couch for $32 a night. On Ames, we have a lady that owns 4 houses in a row. Each house and each room has 2 bunk beds. She's renting each bed for $22 a night, plus $3 cleaning fee. That's gross. So I think the fee, my first thing is about the fee. What do you charge? So Denver charges $50 for the initial fee and then $25 to renew every year. Boulder, which is the most stringent out of all the towns, charges $130 for a 4-year license, and that includes the inspection. I think when you say that that it needs to cover what it costs us, I mean, where do you, if we have 141, if you have an inspector that's making $40,000 a year, that's about close to $300 a license. You can't make it so high that you're force people to not register. Denver has about 2,500 unregistered Airbnbs, and that is half of the Airbnbs in Denver. The point about the 21 plus to rent, to get a hotel is 18 plus, so I don't know why we would discriminate for Airbnbs to be 21. And I think I would much push for the full house rental. I know when I'm renting an Airbnb, I'm renting the whole place. I'm not sharing. I'm not big into sharing. So I think you get a better quality renter when they rent the entire unit versus, a whole bunch of people in that same house. And then the 420 special, I don't know how you enforce that, because if I had one, I would tell you that if you rent the room by 4:20 p.m., you would get a discount, that every day is April 20th here at my Airbnb. I think to outright say a 420 special, yeah, that's really Wheat Ridge. The Airbnbs in Wheat Ridge are really like that. And then the 200 feet. What about duplexes? What about condos? How do we define that? All things to think about, but thanks for bringing this up. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. and Mrs. Jesse, and Ty Jessup on deck.
Christine Jessup, Jessop. I reside at 6730 West 30th Avenue, Wheat Ridge, Colorado. I'm a lifelong resident of Jefferson County and of Wheat Ridge, Colorado. 30th Avenue is zoned as a residential area. 1 year ago, the house at 6695 West 30th Avenue, Wheat Ridge, was sold and moved to Bread and Breakfast. This has turned out to be a commercial business, being rented every day of the year. The noise, trash, on the street, car doors slamming all times of day and night, and sometimes more people staying there than there are beds, is just wrong. This is only hurting our neighborhood, and Wheat Ridge as a city will be known as the B&B town. They don't care what they have done to our street. They have a business to run so that they can make their mortgage. I blame the realtor for marketing this house as a perfect B&B. They know what was going on. Appealing to investors. They know Wheat Ridge has no laws about bread and breakfasts, and that Wheat Ridge won't enforce the current laws on the books for zoning. Let all bread and breakfast be put in a commercial area, just like the motels and the hotels. Our home and tax values keep going up, but I can't imagine that these B&Bs are good for our property value. Nobody will want to buy our properties when they have commercial businesses in our neighborhood. Who in their right mind would want to move into a problem like this? This is a business that is illegal for the type of zoning in this area. R1 means one resident, R2 means like duplex, so forth. C means commercial. I'd like to ask you people that are sitting out there on these boards, how would you like to live next door to an Airbnb? I don't think you would like it. I can't even believe this has gone this far. I say adjourn this meeting and start enforcing the zoning laws that are in effect, and no grandfathering existing bread and breakfasts in the zoning mess. That's why zoning laws were created in the first place, to keep things like this from happening. Last time I checked, I never saw a rezoning hearing on any of the bread and breakfasts in Wheat Ridge, nor did they come around and ask us our input about these properties becoming B&Bs. At least the man that wanted to start a daycare on 31st and Newland came around our neighborhood and asked us our input. And that's where the old church was. Thus, a public hearing was set and a vote, and guess what? No daycare in a residential area because it's a business. Because you did vote him down, we wanted to run a business in that area. It didn't happen. Accommodating the B&Bs is not the answer. The answer to this problem is no B&Bs. We are without the tax base. And I feel that's all you guys want is more money, more money. I say let's adjourn this meeting and start enforcing the zoning laws that are in effect now. I think we put up with enough. It's election time, so remember, we can vote.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ty Jessup and Heather Vanderber on deck.
Janelle, how you doing? Good evening, you guys. I guess I'm here today just to find out where I stand with you people. Okay?
Would you give us your name just for the record?
Ty Jessup, Jessop. I reside at 6730 West 30th Avenue. I've lived in Wheat Ridge for 40 years. From the time I lived here in Wheat Ridge, I couldn't even pass gas without getting permission from the city of Wheat Ridge. Okay? Anything I did, I went through the city of Wheat Ridge to get the okay. In that, everything was online. Okay? My wife told you guys about the gentleman that had bought the church building down there that wanted to start a daycare center. That gentleman came over and asked for our input, how we felt about it now. And I was okay with it, you know. Mike and Romy sell their house. It's okay. I wake up the next morning, they're running a bed and breakfast over there. How would you guys like that? I bought my property as an investment. I'm almost 70 years old. I'm thinking about getting a ranch so I don't have to go down the stair. You think somebody's gonna buy that place for me? If you got a bed and breakfast? We got people pulling in the next door neighbor's driveway at 12 o'clock at night, out there unloading their car. They're at the wrong damn place. You know, I got people pulling up there. I'm up in the middle of the night looking out. Who's out there in front of my house? Is it a thief? A policeman over there. What's it gonna take? Somebody popping cap at somebody's ass? I mean, this is outrageous. I live by what you guys set up. But yet one day somebody wanted to put a business in my block without even asking me how I feel about it. I have no say-so. We got people pulling into that bed and breakfast in the middle of the night. loading a van full of those roller derby, skateboard, whatever you want to call them. You know, I don't know who those people are. I don't know if it's somebody trying to break in my house. I got a wife I need to protect. You ain't got no rule. I only got one voice in this matter, and that is, I think it's you. You're in my district, pal. I filled out my form today. I didn't vote for you, and I'll continue to do that because I'm fed up with it. You expect me to live by the rules, and yet you give other people the opportunity to do as they please. That's all I got to say.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Heather Vanderbuer and Adam Vanderberg on deck.
Hello, my name is Heather Vanderberg, and I live at 7185 West 48th Avenue.
Would you talk into the microphone, please?
Yes, can you hear me now? It's kind of moving. Okay. Good evening, Mr. Mayor and City Council. My family and I have lived in Wheat Ridge for 15 years. We have hosted 2 short-term rentals for almost 2 years in Wheat Ridge within an R2 neighborhood. We've had approximately 200 guests stay from literally all over the world. Many of the guests come to visit family living in Wheat Ridge. It warms my heart when guests request to stay and tell us that they are visiting family who lives down the street. It's wonderful to provide a welcome and cozy home away from home for them. I'm sure you've all heard of the company Airbnb, but do you know how this company assists in the process of screening each individual, guests and hosts? We use the company Airbnb to advertise and manage our bookings. We really like to use this company because it assists in screening the guests. Each individual who uses Airbnb is required to provide government identification, and this must be verified by Airbnb before any booking can be requested. Our family also requires each guest to agree to our rules, provide us with a reason for their travel, who will be coming with them, and when they plan to arrive. This is helpful so we know what to expect for their stay. One of our rules is kindly respect our neighbors. We only allow 2 guests per queen-size bed, so that's a total of 4 guests for each booking. We do this to make sure there's limited traffic and noise, as we want to be respectful of our neighbors. We do not allow any parties or events, and no one is allowed on the property without prior approval. In addition to these requirements, we also screen each guest by their previous ratings. Each time a guest uses Airbnb, they are rated on their cleanliness, communication, and ability to follow the rules that are enforced by the host. The previous hosts also provide a summary of their experience with the guest visits. This is a great tool to ensure that we as hosts are only accepting guests who will respect our neighborhood and our home. Each guest is rated with each booking, but also each host is rated for each booking as well. If a host does not provide the best possible experience, it will show on their rating for their listing. If you're not doing a good job at maintaining your property and providing a great experience, it's reflected on your listing. As hosts, we are able to pay cleaners and yard maintenance crews to make sure that our short-term rentals are in tip-top shape. We also have a chalkboard in each of our short-term rentals that provides great places to visit, eat, and shop in our neighborhood. Allowing short-term rentals in Wheat Ridge will provide a positive economic impact to our citizens and city. I just wanted to give you an overview of how we manage and screen our guests. We take this very seriously, and we want to make sure that this is a positive experience for everyone. We look forward to smart regulations to provide guests to come and experience our lovely town of Wheat Ridge. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Adam Vanderburg and Benji Vanderburg on deck.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and City Council. My name is Adam Vanderburg, and I live at 7185 West 48th Avenue. I have lived in Wheat Ridge my entire life, and I love the feeling of living in a small town. My family has 2 short-term rentals in Wheat Ridge. I help my mom and dad with setting codes on the door for the guests and other stuff they ask me to do. I have got to meet many kids who stay with us. We play outdoors on the trampoline, we play basketball, and sometimes video games when it's cold. One boy named Ajax stays stayed at our short-term rental for 2 weeks with his mom. Ajax came to get medical care that he could not get in his own town. We spent time together playing and even went to Dave & Buster's together to eat dinner and play. I just want to let you know that all of our guests have been super nice and it is not scary to have guests visit us.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Benji Vanderburg and Mike Pleiss on deck.
My bad. Good evening. My name is Benji Vanderburg, Vandeburgh. I've lived in Wheat Ridge for 15 years. In case you didn't hear, we currently run 2 short-term rentals in Wheat Ridge. One has been running for almost 2 years with close to 200 guests and no major problems at all. The other is our old house, which we rented long-term for about 7 years, and just recently in June of this year, we converted it to a short-term rental. As a homeowner, there's a lot of advantages to renting a property short-term versus long-term, including being actually involved in the maintenance and upkeep of the property, and you're able to monitor the conditions and know what's going on. You have a lot more presence on the property. We would love to have the opportunity to continue to operate our 2 short-term rentals responsibly in Wheat Ridge. Short-term rentals are a very complicated issue, which do not have a lot of unbiased data collected yet. We don't know exactly how they affect things like housing prices, rental rates, nuisance violations, and other impacts on neighborhoods. I hear a lot of people talk about noise, trash, increased traffic, and parking problems. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I haven't personally seen this, nor can I find any evidence which suggests that short-term rentals are more prone to these types of nuisances. My suggestion is to start with licensing and requiring that those license numbers are posted in the listing. Also, practical safety standards should be implemented, such as having adequate egress, fire extinguishers, and first aid kits. I hope that Wheat Ridge City Council will carefully examine this issue, collect some accurate data, and implement licensing and regulation that is a win for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mike Pleiss, and
Yes, I live on 6670 West 30th Ave. My name is Mike Pleiss, Pleiss. I live across the street from a short-term rental, and I just wanted to tell you my experience. I look at it every day. I look at it before I leave to work, when I'm getting dressed in the morning, and when I come home. And I get to see people from all over the country's license plates. I get to see them coming and going from their vehicles and guess what they might be up to. And sometimes I know what they're up to because I can see right out my window. So 2 years ago, my wife and I were looking for the perfect place for our family. We had a daughter at the time that was 1.5. Now, 2 years later, she just turned 4 on Saturday. We got her a bike, and I remember one of the biggest things was, this street's so quiet. Oh my gosh, she could ride her bike. This is gonna be great. And we don't have sidewalks, so all the parking that has come with the short-term rental has kind of made me, question whether or not that's gonna be the case. This is gonna be a good place for her to ride her bike. Well, that comes very close to home and emotional for me because, I got another infant that's 6 months old, and I'm just thinking about my family all the time, and all the thought that goes into finding the perfect dream home for your family just goes out the window when suddenly you have a business across the street that's taking your quiet neighborhood and to some extent exploiting that quality and all the neighbors' hard work to make it what it is into an advertising piece. And you can see that in the headline for the short-term rental across the street from me, advertised as a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood, not to mention somehow 420 also going into that concept. But we're not getting anything from this business across the street that's profiting off of all of our lives and the value we make from our home. And it doesn't seem fair. It just seems like for some reason I have to work for paying my mortgage, yet a business can operate like this across the street and not contribute anything to our neighborhood, which I think is a great place. And I want to share one of my most memorable short-term rental experiences is when I was out watering my flowers in August, and I see about 10 to a dozen people come out of the front door and proceed to all grab a drink, a beer, or something out of the cooler. Half of them open them, start drinking, get into their two vehicles. Two of the guys get on the cooler in the back of the pickup truck, and when I put my hands on my hips and start shaking my head, they sarcastically wave at me and smile. And I feel like, why should I be the chump? This is my house, and here I'm feeling uncomfortable from these people. The other thing that really bothers me is events that are taking place. Come home on a Saturday afternoon, and for some reason, there's 10 cars on my street. And why do I know they're having a party? Because it's in the front lawn. And why do I know they're drinking? Because I can see them out my window. And I feel regulation is going to help people that own their house and want to live in it coexist with these people that are running businesses in our neighborhood. I know it's not going to go away, but some regulation will help, and getting people not parking on the street is going to be a big one, as well as no parties, nightly minimums, taxing them, and trying to set up some rules for the things that I know anyone that lives anywhere near a short-term rental would agree with me.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker is, I believe it's Cage Whitaker, and Weston Gouger is after that.
Yes, it's actually Kerry Whitaker. I tell you by my handwriting, I should be a doctor. So,
It's okay, just spell your last name for us.
last name is Whitaker, Whitaker. So, good evening, Mayor and members of City Council. I'm here to, a lot of the people from our street are here tonight to talk about our experience. The catalyst for us speaking up and sending you all a letter with everyone on our street except for 2 people signing it in May was that we had an initial Airbnb or short-term rental on our street where they possibly converted the basement into an illegal duplex and have 2 or 3 long-term renters living in the basement, and then they rent the upstairs to up to 12 people. And so this was a shock to our quiet little neighborhood, and we sent a letter to all of you describing our concern and asking for your help. And on that note, I do want to thank David and Janice for meeting with us. Also, Leah and Zach met with us as well. But I really thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and hearing our concerns and learning more about this issue. I believe you've all seen the framework that Janice has proposed. I think a lot of details still need to be filled out, but in general, most of us on our street can support that concept. But I do think you all need to take a real deep dive into the owner-occupied issue. And maybe not from a short-term rental perspective, but from 2 other perspectives. The first being financial crisis. 11 years ago, we went through one of the worst financial crises our country has seen. I know this because I was tasked with implementing Colorado's first mortgage regulatory program and cleaning up the industry through the foreclosure and the financial crisis. If there's one thing that we learned, it was that people should not be buying homes that they can't afford. Now, I understand if people have hardships and they need to rent out a room, that's one thing, but we certainly don't want people buying homes where they're dependent upon the short-term rental income, because they may be just a few bad reviews away from losing it. And the second issue I want you to think about is, and I have articles and 2 studies on this, is the impact on our housing and rental market because of short-term rentals. The University of Southern California and McGill University in Canada both conducted studies on this topic, and they determined that short-term rentals do increase the cost of living. They increase the cost of homes to buy, and they increase the cost of long-term rentals. It's pretty simple economics. The less long-term rentals are on the market, the more expensive they become. And they even stated in their study that year over year, if a home appreciates 6%, that if Airbnbs or short-term rentals exist, that's responsible for driving up the cost almost 1%. So I do have articles on this, if anyone would want. But I ask you to look at the owner-occupied requirement from those two perspectives and really think about that. I don't think, with the, in Colorado, we are in a 20-year affordable and attainable housing crisis. The last thing we need is for our properties to be more expensive. And the last thing I would want would be for us to increase the cost of living on our communities most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you.
And can I pass these out to?
You may. If you'll leave them here, we'll send them around the, and would you give one to Our next speaker is Weston Gouger and Rachel Holteen on deck.
Microphone. Hello, my name is Weston Gouger. I'm a local Wheat Ridge resident on Newland Street. I also own the building formerly owned by Dean and Geraldine Bardon, 6985. If anyone's not aware, the second floor of that is Airbnb units. So I get to speak from someone managing these as an investment property along 38th, as well as a resident who's been here for over 3 years who also Airbnbs his house. So I've been looking forward to this conversation. I'm looking forward to a long conversation that is proactive among our community. I think a result, as everyone said, on both sides, which is something that makes sense for everyone. It is a business for people, and that's a taxable thing for the community. That's great for the economy. But I think it's also important to look at the perspective of people who host their Airbnbs. The lovely flame in the corner who I don't know, but I bet, for me, I can speak for, I bet their mortgage and cash flowing and passive income has something to do with it. I think the way people live their lives is important in this, and what they choose to do with their property is important in this. As important as looking across the street and some jerk giving you the finger. That's as important. So I think developing a community group of citizens to look into this deeply and not make decisions based on the 7 towns around us and what's easy. Properly weighing the emotional response is also very important. It's not uncommon, I'm sure in this room specifically, hearing the emotional response, which oftentimes is a fear of change, which I empathize with. But choking off, I think, the economic and cultural growth that this town is in the midst of, in order to appease fear, would be a bad decision. I have 60 reviews over on 38th in 3 months. I encourage you to look them up, see what people from out of town are saying about our town, why they came here, where they went, where they ate, what they thought. Not about the units. They talk about this place that they didn't expect, how close it is to the mountains, how close it is to Denver, and how it's not, a ridiculous fee to come stay here. This is why, as a resident, I find a lot more value in reading those as a resident than someone who owns the building. I look forward to this conversation. And
Thank you. Would the clerk please reset the lights? Our next speaker is Rachel Holteen, and Tommy Lander, I believe, on deck.
Good evening, I'm Rachel Holteen, and I too am here to share some thoughts on the short-term rental discussion. I've spoken several times about this in the past, and as I've said before, I myself use it almost exclusively when I travel. I find it a great way to find neighborhoods that I wouldn't otherwise encounter when I visit cities, and it allows me to patronize usually small local businesses when I stay at Airbnbs. And I usually like it because it's I meet my hosts, and my hosts usually give me great recommendations. I have on my block, there's one Airbnb sort of towards the end of it, and another one around the corner, and I will say they are 2 of the best kept properties that I drive by every day, and it's because they have to sell how good that property looks every day. We also have several rentals around us, and recently someone rented the rental that's directly across the street from me, and they've been there for about 2 months, and I wish it was an Airbnb because I have 10 more months of constant, yelling at night, cars parked everywhere. So I recognize that there's no perfect solution, but Airbnbs that are properly regulated with clear rules and expectations around the usage of the property and sensitive to parking and the neighbors and with accountability by the Airbnb hosts really can provide a very positive option for the community. I would much rather see the house across the street from me turn into an Airbnb than get stuck with year after year of low-end renters who are really negatively impacting constantly the quality of life on my block. That having been said, I think I'm hearing a lot of consensus that people believe that good regulations will go a long way. We don't have a lot of great options for people who to come to visit me and need a place to stay. I'm glad I've got an Airbnb down the street from me for when family comes, because there really aren't any hotels anywhere near me that I would feel comfortable suggesting to family to stay. So I think regulating it, licensing it, taxing it, and setting high standards aligns with the values that we have as a city. And we are a small town, we're very, very neighborly. But one of the things I've learned since I've moved here is that we take a lot of pride in being able to stay in Wheat Ridge for a long time. And if circumstances change in converting part of your property or all of your property to an Airbnb allows you to stay in the city, that's what I think Wheat Ridge is. If keeping your first house that you got married in, that you have great expectations for, and being able to move to another house in Wheat Ridge and keeping both houses, well, that's a double investment in our city. So I think it allows flexibility, and I think it allows for long-term investments in the city. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tommy Larder.
Hello, thank you. I'm also a host and property owner at 3351
Could you give us
Yukon Court.
your name and address, please?
I'm sorry, Tommy Lorden. I live in Boulder at 3015 Jefferson Street, but I own 3351 Yukon Court, just across the way. I agree with all the comments stated from a host, and I wanted to add kind of a different perspective and situation. My wife and I have 4 children in Boulder, and we are looking forward to the day when we can move back to earth, get out of Boulder and be empty nesters. And a couple years ago, we started looking something close to Denver and settled on Wheat Ridge as a good potential option for us. And in a rising housing market, we decided to buy a home over on Yukon Court. And to cover our costs in the meantime, we have made it into a wonderful short-term rental that I like to think makes the city proud and is a very nice product that is otherwise not readily available. Echoing the comments about the guest reviews and the things we see. It's also been pleasing to neighbors to the extent that last Christmas people rented it so that they could walk to their family across the street and things of that nature. The one thing I wanted to ask, I guess for consideration going forward in the environment, and clearly which some licensing and regulation makes sense, is that if there is a primary residence requirement, that you consider grandfathering people like myself who have been great citizens and invested a lot in making the neighborhood and community a better place. Because to change the rules suddenly would really disadvantage us. We spent a lot of money to furnish it, and we take great care of our guests and our neighbors. And that's really my comment, is to please consider a grandfather clause if you do move in the direction of primary residence, which I don't even fully understand the benefit in that. You probably know more than I do, but if it were to prevent big investors and corporate things, I would think there might be other ways to do that too. But whatever way you go, I just wanted you to be cognizant that there are some people who have invested a lot. And if you change that aspect, it would be really harmful. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all of the people that I have signed up on my sheet to speak. Is there anyone here who has not signed up who would like to speak at this time? You may come and form a line right here and give us your name and address. If you would spell your last name. Please reset the lights.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ohmart, O-H-M-A-R-T. I live on Zephyr Street around 44th. And
You have an address there?
4455 Zephyr. we had a lady who, I've been here for 32 years, by the way, and a lady across the fence from us opened up an Airbnb, and she is a delightful lady. She has had people from all over the world stay at her facility where she has 2 extra bedrooms, and they have been wonderful people. And the only complaint I've heard from neighbors is that, oh, they park in front of my house. And it's like, okay, I have a church at the end of my street at 44th and Wadsworth, and I get those people parking in front of my house every week, sometimes twice in a week. And they're fun and delightful people. But I'll tell you what, it's amazing to watch people from all over the world come here to experience Colorado and to have a wonderful time here with people who care for them and make sure they have a wonderful experience. And so, yes, there may be some need for regulation, as long as it doesn't get out of bounds, and that these people can come here and enjoy themselves. And I think it'd be wonderful to have Airbnbs available to them so that they can enjoy Wheat Ridge as we enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Samuel Harris, Samuelharris. I live in Denver, but I manage some properties for homeowners in Denver, in Wheat Ridge and Arvada. Wheat Ridge is 9889 West 32nd Avenue. Really cute, beautiful farm-style house. It was a hoarder house. This couple bought it, gutted it, turned it into something really beautiful when it was not well taken care of. I just wanted to shed some positivity on Airbnb and short-term rental in general. I do hear a lot of negative feedback, and I do feel for a lot of the neighborhoods that have been affected in a negative way. I definitely think there are ways to combat that. My biggest priority as a property manager is to get the community and the neighborhoods involved in a way where they feel like there's not, like they said, investors coming in and taking over this neighborhood. That's not what my goal as a manager, and also not what my homeowners want either. People come here for funerals, they come here for family visits, for births, for honeymoons, for medical care that they can't get elsewhere. I've heard a lot of stories on people coming to Denver for adoptions, and sometimes coming back and staying in the same place where they first adopted their kid or had their birth with their child. Whatever the situation is, it's been a positive thing in that regard. For me, I know I take very seriously guest vetting. We want to prevent parties. We want to prevent wild things happening. And granted, there's going to be pros and cons to any type of situation. You can't always prevent those situations, but as much as we can, we try and prevent parties and large guests and anything like that. I know on my end, I require a security deposit if I find out there's been, marijuana smoking in the house or large parties. They don't get their security deposit back, so just little things. I would say for neighbors that are concerned about STR in their community is to get to know that home, get to know that property manager or that homeowner, and so that you build a stronger community. It's become an amazing way to connect worlds, to connect neighborhoods together, and I've met so many people from all around the world. People want to come to Denver and they want to experience Denver and the surrounding area. They want to experience an authentic stay. They don't want to stay in just like a regular neighborhood in a regular hotel.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Oh, thank you.
Is there anyone else that wants to speak tonight that hasn't spoken? Thank you. We'll close our public comment. We will recognize Councilor Davis. Thank you for joining us. And we will move to item number 1 on our agenda. This is the preferred concept design for the green at 38th Avenue. We'll go to Mr. Johnstone.
That is a graphic of what we're talking about tonight, and you have that in your packet as well. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We are here tonight to give you an update on our ongoing discussions about what we've come to call the green, which is the common grassy area out in front of Stevens Elementary School at the corner of 38th and High Court. It is property that's owned by Jefferson County School District. We have been partnering with the school district for a number of years, and I would just acknowledge that Bruce Huxley is here representing the school, as well as Mark Naylor, our designer on this project, so we can use them as resources as you see fit as well. So we have been partnering with the school district for a number of years on joint use of this property. We actually have had since 2013 a shared use agreement that is just a 3-year agreement and it renews automatically for every 3 years unless either party wants to renegotiate that. This really stems a lot from adoption of the 2011 38th Avenue corridor plan, which had a lot of recommendations which were listed in your staff report for doing additional community events on 38th Avenue and specifically looking at ways that this specific area could be programmed better to handle the types of events that we were anticipating having. So after adoption of the corridor plan in 2011, the city actually did contract with a design group known as Intelliky to do a preliminary design both for the streetscape along 38th Avenue, but also specifically to program this area, and came up with some different designs that would, presumably make it function better for certain events and for vendors, et cetera. There was no decision at that time to come up with a scope of work and go under construction, but we've continued to keep this on the list of things that could be done. In 2018, last year, the 38th Avenue streetscape continued to be a priority on your strategic plan, and specifically the idea of looking at a conceptual plan for this property was identified as a priority. Relatively late in 2018, we hired Arcterra, the design group, to take a look at this. They've done some other work on the city over the years as well. They partnered with various stakeholders to look at various different designs. They worked with the school district and various different people at the school district, as well as Local Works, who obviously is, Kate Cook is here as well in the audience, who's the executive director, but they program a lot of events for that area. And based on that, we've come up with this design, and Mark can speak to it as well. We'll bring him up in a second, but it really changes the design so that the proposed green would actually run parallel to 38th Avenue, and the parking lot that the school district uses and then we use for the events gets oriented adjacent to the school. We think this has a few advantages. It definitely better meets the school's kind of safety and security needs, as well as just convenience needs. It makes for a more efficient design of the parking lot while still maintaining the same number of spaces. It gives the green a much stronger visible presence along 38th Avenue in terms of branding the main street as our corridor with these public spaces. And it provides, I think, for a logical extension of the streetscape improvements that are being built by West End 38 as part of that private project immediately to the east. As I noted, we already do have an agreement with the school district, but we also recognize that if we're going to be making significant capital investments in this, we have budgeted $900,000 in 2020 budget, that it'd be important to firm that up. We included in your packet an agreement that the school district has with the city of Arvada that was recently executed. That's actually a 99-year lease agreement for a similar situation where they're partnering with the city of Arvada on a park area. So tonight we're requesting direction from City Council whether you want us to keep moving forward and move towards costing this out better as a conceptual design, and if so, we'll continue to work with Arcterra and the school district on negotiating costs and cost sharing in terms of a shared use agreement. And Mark, would you mind coming up and maybe going over your summary of the design? You can grab a seat over here.
Go ahead and pull that microphone over to you and press the button and you'll get a green light.
Right here?
You're live there.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
You don't have to hold it.
Oh, thank you. So, yeah, in terms of the design, as you know, the city has partnered with Local Works for a lot of different events at this site. So it's movies in the park on Friday Night Live. It's, trunk or treat, the holiday celebration, fitness in the park, things like that. So The design really focuses on trying to provide a flexible space that is really designed for those kind of uses. You know, right now it's sort of, I guess for lack of a better term, sort of a leftover space that's being used for those events. So this is something that really focuses on that with a great lawn. There's a stage for things like movies or concerts or other kinds of events like that. But there's also looking for, the design is also looking at flexibility to potentially host other kinds of events. So some of the things we've talked about are farmers markets or craft fairs, those kind of things. So you can see there's a sort of the curved walkway around the outside is a festival promenade that could be used for those kind of events as well, maybe food trucks during other kinds of events. And at the same time, trying to think about how does the site get used when events like that are not happening. So there's some other seating areas that can be, you know, those could include game tables or, you know, picnic tables, things like that to really activate the site kind of at all times. I think that's, you know, sort of the main things for the park itself. And then as Ken was mentioning, I think it is really important that the way that the parking lot has changed really does provide a really important delineation between park and school, and it also takes advantage of that whole sort of 38th streetscape, which really is, to me, an important part of activating that whole street and that space as well.
Thank you.
So we'll just open it up for questions.
Questions, Ms. Davis.
I don't have as many questions as I do comments. It's thank you for being here tonight because I think we've heard a lot that Jefferson County didn't know anything about this and they're not involved. So it's nice to see, yes, we have representation. And as far as a safety aspect, that they had concerns about the safety. So it's nice to have you reiterate that, yes, you are involved, and this is. Oh, you're not with Jefferson County? Who's with
No,
Jefferson?
he's our designer.
But Bruce is in the audience here.
I guess we might have would you, just in case we have questions for you, would you like to sit up here? Or I guess we have representation here from Jefferson County that basically states that, yes, they are a part of the process. They do feel that the setup is safer, and they are working with Wheat Ridge. The other comment I wanted to make is it's nice to see the agreement that was made with Arvada, just because one of my questions was based off of if we continually have 3-year agreements and they're updating, you know, who's to say that 3 years goes by and it's like, thanks, but no thanks. So it's nice to see this longer leasing type of agreement or intergovernmental agreement. So it's nice to see that as well. So thank you both actually for being here.
Thank you. Additional comments or questions? Ms. Dozman.
Are the blue features there, are those water features? Is that what does that represent?
Tables.
Just tables? Okay.
Thank you. Additional questions or comments? Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So with respect to the lease from the school district, would it be materially similar to the agreement that we see in the packet, or what's the sort of the width and breadth of the lease term that we're looking at? Do we know?
We haven't, other than them sharing that, and we're liking to see the 99-year term. We haven't really dived down into how good of a fit that is for this property as well. But it's certainly a good starting point to show that they've done this before and are willing to do it in a similar fashion again.
Okay. And I guess one of my concerns regarding this shared use process is that as a vice chair of the Jefferson County Housing Authority, we recently had asked the school district to allow us several parking spaces at Golden High School to use with respect to an affordable housing project. And the agreement that they brought back was just simply a license to use the spaces, a increase in the number of, or an increase in the rate that they were going to charge year after year, making it untenable for the housing authority to participate in that agreement. And when I see an agreement of 99 years for $10 or what have you, it just seems very generous and very rich for this project, but when it comes to affordable housing, the school district couldn't be bothered. So that does concern me a little bit when I see this, that, yeah, these terms look great, but when it gets down to brass tacks, what about subletting? Who applies for the special events permit with respect to various activities regarding liquor on that property? Is it the principal? Is it the superintendent of schools? Is it the person that's running this project? As far as farmers markets, how do we go about allowing that activity on the school grounds? Are we then subleasing this to somebody else? So that's a concern. And then is there going to be shared parking as a part of this, or how is it just that we're sharing the green space, or are we sharing parking as well?
Both. I would anticipate it would be both.
Would that then be public parking that could be used by the surrounding apartments, or would it just be for while they're there at
I don't know if Bruce would have a comment on that, but I don't, certainly not during the times when the school is actively using it. I mean, they need to maintain that. Even before we had this more formal agreement, we had an informal agreement to use the parking lot with the school district. So they've been very flexible on that, knowing that that's an asset that clearly they don't need on significant portions of the day or different times of the year.
Okay. So for a variety of reasons, not even getting into the $900,000 that we could be putting towards a variety of other efforts, I just don't see the need to fix up Stevens Elementary to this degree. I don't disagree with doing something there in some regard, but $900,000 when the school district couldn't be bothered to support affordable housing. And I get that they're two totally different agreements, two totally separate things, but I'm looking at it from the outside in and saying, yeah, they'll take it over here when they're fixing up their property, but they won't help in the affordable housing degree, and so I will not be supporting this.
Mr. Matthews?
Thank you. Yeah, there again, I have concerns here, because looking through our sample lease here, Arvada agrees to pay, and Arvada agrees to pay rent and cost to the design and cost to the development, all maintenance and upkeep. So I'm not sure that I see this necessarily as a partnership. Does that mean that we can prohibit the kids from going out and playing on the grass that we're maintaining? You know, or is it going to be a park? How much is that going to cost us in the future? And where do the maintenance costs end, including the concrete flat work and all that? Are we going to be responsible for that? I'd like to ask a question here, and Ms. Dolzman might have the answer. I've heard in the past that we're holding trunk or treat over at Lutheran because we needed more space. And that's one of my concerns, is if we can't even do trick or treat on that site, if it doesn't have the capacity, and we're expecting to grow. I mean, we're going to have, 300 apartments almost next door to it, 200 apartments. If it doesn't match existing capacity now and we have to go off-site for just trick or treat, trunk or treat, what's going to be the capacity for us? How can we use it, today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I have a concern about spending $900,000 for a site that already doesn't meet. I mean, someone just mentioned holding trunk or treat there. Well, they can't because they've already moved it off site for lack of space. I'm just not sure that this is the right site for us. And, they go to trunk or treat because it's safe and they have more space somewhere else. I'd rather spend $900,000 to make our neighborhood safe so the kids can get to know their own neighbors rather than coming to Lutheran's parking lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pod?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the work. I support this. I will certainly enjoy watching council talk through the agreement in the future, but I think that the foundation of that is in here, and certainly hope that the terms are similar to what we could ask for and get, and certainly work through those details. I think the design is well thought. It took me a second. I've seen it and thought about it oriented the other way so long, to be honest, that it took me a second to look at this and appreciate it. But I do appreciate it, and I think that we all should, for doing a number of things, really representing and kind of orienting itself to 38th Avenue in a much more, in a much stronger way along a longer frontage, and I think that really helps in a number of ways. and it creates both entry and armoring for that space in the way that it's elevated in the stairs in those corners, and I think really creates a lot of opportunities that you already mentioned about how we can activate even the details of that space. There's a lot of things to I think, appreciate from that. And the parking and the separation or kind of reorganizing at the front of the school, I think is very smart. I agree that thinking about how the parking is, quote, shared and or how it is really an asset for these events and other uses is something that should be worked out through kind of the completion of the design and the agreement. Because I think there's great value even to kind of how you can really maximize the use of the parking as additional event kind of space for some of the things that we've already done or can think about doing in the future. So anyway, I'll support moving this forward. I know there may be some other comments, but I appreciate where we're at, and I look forward to all your hard work in the future on this.
Thank you, Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to everyone who's come to discuss this and for bringing this design forward. Some of my comments, I don't really have very many questions, but some of my comments are, I do like that the way, I drive by that school every morning at time of drop-off and every afternoon at time of pickup, and I know that the traffic pattern currently is really ineffective for their school, and they have a lot of problems with that, and I can see, as being one of those drop-off moms at 3 other schools, that this will have a really good traffic flow, which will be really good for for the families and the parents there. But I appreciate that the green has been moved up towards 38th Avenue. Part of this, the whole thing was that we were looking to find a Main Street identity in our community. 38th Avenue is identified as that space to do that. However, as you drive down 38th Avenue, there is no other opportunity for a large green space, gathering space on 38th Avenue. And so this is our only opportunity. And I think it's important for our community, and we work really hard to try to activate our community around living and spending their money and their time in our community rather than going out to our neighboring communities to spend their monies and their time. And so doing things like events down on 38th Avenue, creating more walkable spaces like on 44th Avenue or even on West 38th where there are no sidewalks. Like those are goals that we are working towards in the future. And so I know that this plan as a Main Street has been an airball for a long time, and I would really like to, I'll support moving it forward. I know that this example of a lease agreement is not going to be our lease agreement. I also know that before we even put a shovel in the ground, that we will have a lease agreement that we agree with, and so, I like that it's proof saying that, we already do this in Arvada with another school, and it's unfortunate what had happened with Zach, but those are two, I think, totally separate issues. So thanks for bringing this forward.
Ms. Weaver.
Thank you for bringing it forward. I have a couple questions, and I really like the concept, and I like the stage, and I'm thinking about all of the events that happen or have been planned in the last several years here. And I would really like to see, though I support it, I also think the point that was brought up of how many people can use this space. At what point will we say, wow, can 10,000 people be there? And where will they park? And right, because there's also this conversation about the events that we're having there. And I would like to know at what point will we say we can only have X amount of people in this park for this event, and understand how that works. And I do like the stage brought more forward, but my question is, in having planned musical events, how does that work for the events that are there? Because it seems like there have been several events throughout the year that have musicians and big stages that are brought in. Will this stage allow for them, like Local Works, not to have to spend the thousands of dollars on the stage equipment? Or, I mean, does this suffice as an actual acoustical stage?
Yeah, so at this point, it's a really conceptual plan.
Oh, okay.
We're basically just showing a stage area.
Okay.
So I think there's opportunities for that to be developed in whatever way the city thinks works best.
Okay. I guess I would just like us to really bring the ends together as far as the types of events we're doing and the space we have, because sometimes there's a mismatch between we're going to bring in big acts for an acoustical event, and you have to have the appropriate kind of stage to do that, or else you have to then spend X amount of $1,000. And I know that people in the Carnation Festival know this for having to rent all those things every year. So I would just really like to see, for the money that we're spending, that the features we put in here really serve for the events that are working, if that makes sense. And I would really like to know the actual numbers of, if we're talking about Harvest Fest, what was the most recent one? Ridge Fest. You know, how many people do we expect to grow that to? Or are we at max? And I'm thinking of the Taste of Colorado that I started going to 20 years ago when it was really fun, and I don't go anymore because it's way too crowded and it's not fun. And I would hate for us to sort of have the space end up being run down or not. Does that make sense? I'd like to make sure that the use and the money we're spending fits the events that we're trying to have there. But I really like the concept, and I'm excited that it works for the school as well. I do have one question. Is it a problem that the stage is closer to the street? Because typically it's back where the word walkway is for Ridgefest. And has anybody, I mean, does street noise affect if you bring it forward, or does anybody know the answer to that question?
Yeah, I think we'd have to, I mean, there's been no acoustic, kind of check or anything on that site.
Okay.
But I mean, I think we could look at similar parks and, make sure that we're within a reasonable distance.
Cool, because it would be neat if we're spending the money to really make it a park that really fits the cool things that we're doing.
Yeah,
I guess is
absolutely.
my point. Thanks.
Mr. Matthews.
Thank you. There's one other 500-pound elephant in the room here, and is Jeffco going to guarantee that we can occupy this property for the full term of the lease? What happens if we invest $900,000 in this, and 5 years from now they decide to close the school? And that's a real, Jeffco's always closing schools. I mean, at one point in time, they built a school up north, and 40 years later, still a good school, but they closed it. And can we buy part of the property? Do we have to buy all the property? What happens in that scenario, and when?
Mr. Urban? Excuse me, did you ever reply to that? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a good point. I think we can work through that with the school district, but duly noted.
Mr. Urban?
I guess my question is regarding has there been any research regarding the deed restriction on the property? Because since April 26, 1873, this particular property has only been used for educational purposes, and it is the longest use in the state of Colorado with respect to educational uses. So do we know whether this lease or this improvement would, or if there is any deed restrictions on this property relative to other uses?
I don't know that.
Okay.
Ms. Hoppy? Would you like to?
Bruce could add that.
Please come to a microphone. We can accommodate you at our table here if you'd like to join us, and if you'd give us your name, please.
So to respond on the site restrictions, no, the state
Could you give us your name?
Oh, sorry, Bruce Huxley, Jefferson County School District Director of Property and Planning. With respect to use of educational facilities, the state has given authority to school districts to lease property as long as it is for the community good, and we would consider this the community, a community benefit. It will be a long-term lease. We haven't worked out the details yet. A lot of comments on the details that we haven't started negotiating. Essentially, the lease would run with the land. So if the school district did decide to sell the property, you would still have a valid lease under that new owner. And they would have to abide by the provisions of the original lease unless both parties agreed to renegotiate.
Thank you. Mr. Keeter.
So very quickly on that, the Arvada lease includes a right of first refusal. So if at any time the school district decides to sell the property, they first have to offer it up to the city of Arvada to purchase it.
Correct.
That was my question, though. Do we get just our piece of the property? Do we have to buy the abandoned school also as one parcel piece?
That would be part of, I mean, that could be part of the negotiations if it's just that parcel entire. I don't see how we would negotiate, you'd have to buy the entire acreage on that. But, 50 years, 99 years is a long time for, a long-term lease. But as long as it's a legal document, it's recorded, and any future owners need to abide by that.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy?
I just wanted to ask about who were the stakeholders in the meetings that you were when you were talking to about this design. Like, the local works have a representative there, the school PTA have a representative there. Like, in the meetings where you guys were going over this kind of, what are the options? Can you just tell us who was in the room?
Yeah, there were a lot of stakeholders involved. There was Jefferson County Schools. There was the principal of Stevens Elementary. There were business owners along 38th Street. Who else was involved in that, Ken?
The city staff, park staff,
Local Works.
Local Works had several representatives there, and to answer Ms. Hoppy's question regarding, I'm not sure about PTA specifically, but it definitely wasn't just administration. It was people that had more on-the-ground stake in the facility.
I'd like to ask our school representative, does this enhance the safety and security of the school children that are going to school at Stevens Elementary?
We believe it will. If the city decides to move forward with this plan, we like it because it does give us a physical barrier with the parking lot. Visually from the entrance, which is just north off the plan to the north, it gives us better vision of anyone approaching. Right now, we've got that sort of semicircular parking lot to the southwest, and then on the east side, we've got the park that runs up to near the entrance, and that's always been a concern for us. So we like the physical barrier there. We like the fact that we can queue many more cars on the site and off the streets, which adds to public safety on the streets with students crossing streets and things like that. And there's always the rogue parent that, has their kid run across the street and things like that. But we also like the fact that on, I can't read the street, is that Reed Street off to the right there? That's we'll have bus drop off and pick up on that street there. And brings that bus circulation off our site and keeps it on the street, which is a more efficient routing for our transportation department. So we are amenable to this concept, details to be worked out.
Thank you. Ms. Dozman.
So is there, on Upham Street to the west there, is just one entrance and exit for parking? Okay. So I really appreciate how the design has been reoriented to but the design up to 38th Avenue as opposed to the school frontage. That was a major concern of mine during the initial design concept. So I really like that it's more along 38th Avenue to represent what its use is going to be for the city of Wheat Ridge. I don't feel comfortable agreeing to a price tag at this moment without seeing a very thorough IGA. Many of us have had questions about details as far as what that would look like, and I have a really hard time investing $100,000 shy of $1 million into a school property and a property that we don't own as a community. Although I do see the benefit as far as what we are trying to bring to 38th Avenue and our main street. I'm also really concerned with the equity that this is going to bring. Mr. Matthews has already brought the point up of school closures. In fact, that's why I had decided to run for office, is because Pennington Elementary is the school that I attended and that my son attends now, and we were on a school closure list and really close to being closed down. It was actually a 3-2 vote. Martinson Elementary has been closed, Fruitdale Preschool was closed, and now it's been refurbished as the Fruitdale Lofts. Wheat Ridge Middle School, which is where now Stevens Elementary is, it was closed and turned into a K through 8, and then it was closed again, and now it's Stevens Elementary. So I think that is a very valid concern of a potential school closure. Especially if we are going to be investing this kind of money into a school when our student-based budgeting puts many of our schools at odds and has them competing against each other. And with a lot of failing infrastructure, I know that with the mill and bond, we are going to be investing millions of dollars into each of our schools here in Wheat Ridge, and I'm very thankful for the leadership at Jeffco for making that happen and for the citizens in passing that. But I have a really hard time agreeing to invest this kind of money in one school in our community on a property that we don't own, when I feel that the green as it stands right now is serving its purpose, and it actually may not be, because some of the events are seemingly outgrowing the site, which is something that I think we should definitely be looking at as far as capacity and what this property can maintain, and what some of those events look like in the future. So I'm really concerned. I have a lot more questions than I have answers to tonight, and I don't feel comfortable approving any kind of price tag right now until I see an IGA. Thank you.
Ms. Hoppy.
Yeah, we definitely have some more work, but I think the question tonight is, should we continue to move forward with this? And then, as far as the budget goes, they can't move forward with the design without having at least a budget in mind of knowing how far, because you say, yeah, move forward, and they could come back with, a $1 bazillion plan or not. But I would just like to say that we have already authorized when we approved our budget, we've already authorized $900,000. And so that part of it's already authorized. So I think tonight, and I could be wrong, is asking, do we want to move forward in trying to get this from a sketch pad, into something more firm? Is that right, Kim?
Yeah, I think if with council's support, we'd move forward on two fronts and taking into account, I think, all of these very good comments. But one front would be, I think, in talking with Mark, I think we probably need 30% designs to be able to get you a cost estimate that we think, is worth looking at with some value to it, without, a huge contingency that just leaves too many questions. And programmatically, in terms of the space needs and all the other issues that have been raised, I think we can answer some of those questions as we go through that 30% design process. And then on a parallel track, keep moving forward with hashing out some details with the school district about the lease terms, and keeping in mind some of the, again, valid points that have been raised tonight in terms of what level of certainty people will want for those different scenarios down the road, whether it be school closures or school sales, or it's good to hear Bruce say that, in his mind, the lease would run with the land, that would, keep our right in place, even if they did sell other portions of the property. It is a big property, as you likely know.
Ms. Hoppy?
Great. Then I'd like to ask for consensus to move forward to a 30% design, and to be able to hammer out some of those more details and bring them back to City Council for further discussion.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, we have consensus on that.
Thank you.
And Mr. Johnson, do you have any other, have you got what you need on this item? I do. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take about a 10-minute break before we will be back here at 8 o'clock to talk about item number 2. session for October 21. We will now move to item number 2 on our discussion. This is short-term rentals. The update and discussion, Mr. Johnstone.
Thank you, Mayor. So short-term rentals, obviously it's a hot topic. It's a topic that we've been discussing as a community for a number of years in one form or fashion. And as we've communicated to you in the past, the Wheat Ridge Code of Laws currently is silent to short-term rentals as a specific topic, largely because it wasn't kind of a thing, I suppose, the last time applicable sections of the code were amended. That said, there are sections of the code that speak kind of secondarily to this type of an operation, and based on those sections of the code, we've made the determination that they are generally, essentially not allowed. So that's been our policy position. We have not been taking an active enforcement role in terms of enforcing against short-term rentals for a variety of reasons that I can elaborate on if there are questions. But we've been communicating to people that ask the question of, can I do a short-term rental in Wheat Ridge? The answer has been no. We have been monitoring the trend locally and nationally for sure, as I'm sure you have as well. And you did include in your 2018-2019 strategic plan developing a policy on short-term rentals as one of your top 5 priorities. So it certainly is something that you've been wanting to talk about. To that end, back in March, we had a study session with council, briefed you on the topic, and that included kind of an overview of what STRs are and are not, so that we were all kind of on the same page from that perspective. We did have more of a deeper dive on what our existing code sections that apply to the topic are. We had some survey questions from the citizen survey that we informed you about as well. And then we did an overview, as we often do, of what other cities are doing. Certainly some in the metro area and nationally across the state are regulating these in certain manners, quite a number of different ways. And certainly many communities are currently choosing not to regulate them specifically. One of the things that came out of the March study session was that you requested, I think smartly, a survey, an internal survey of City Council and the Mayor to kind of gauge your policy thoughts or whether there was some consensus on certain different regulatory approaches. That survey wrapped up in September, and staff assembled those results, and the results of that are summarized in I think it's the September 9th memo from Scott Cutler that we included in your packet. We also included the raw data in your packet as well, so you can look at that. By way of just kind of quick summary of what we saw as some of the trends in consensus, I think there was consensus for some sort of a licensing program for short-term rentals, some sort of with an associated fee, and what that might be would need a lot of thought. Collecting of a lodger's tax, there was consensus on. There was consensus to allow partial home STRs, but maybe a little less of a consensus of whether to allow full home short-term rentals. We had mentioned that, additional staffing would likely be needed. We don't know what that looks like. It'll depend a lot on what the regulatory approach is, but there was a general acknowledgement that additional staffing might be needed to research that program. So we'll have to evaluate that more. There was some support for a requirement that a short-term rental be the owner's primary resident, but this was a little bit weaker. And then kind of going down the line of what the support was gets a little less clear. There was some support for whole-term STRs, but it just wasn't as clear of a consensus as for partial home STRs. There was kind of mixed opinions about what zoning districts, but I think the takeaway that I had from that was there was consensus on just doing it in all residential districts and not distinguishing between R1 or R2 or what have you. And the last thing where it wasn't entirely clear was some communities, Denver has certainly done this, have placed a limit on the total number of days that you could do a short-term rental, particularly if you're making it a requirement that it be the primary residence. Then kind of the parallel or the backstop to that would be, okay, it has to be your primary residence, and the maximum number of days that you can rent out rooms is, you pick the number. But there definitely wasn't consensus on that. So glad to be here to hear your comments and get some direction. It's a complicated topic, and as you know, I think was communicated by the public, there's a lot of different opinions on this, and a lot of different regulatory approaches that one might take. The only, I guess, the other thing I'd say before turning it over to all you to talk about, which is why we're here, is that whatever we do is going to be complicated, and it's going to be, if it's going to take a lot of resources just to get this something to the finish line. So if this is a priority for you, just understand that that's fine. It's going to be a pretty big priority for us in terms of resources as well, because it'll be complicated, and probably also want to think about what, if any, additional public outreach would be desired as part of that process, and when that might occur relative to drafting of regulations as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, we'll open it up for questions or comments. Ms. Hoppy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This has kind of been an airball for us for a really long time. 2 airballs in one night is kind of what we're tackling. But the Councilmember Keeter and I met with some District 1 residents, and they wrote down, after we listened to their stories and everything, they wrote down suggestions that they had that they would like to see would happen in regulation on these sticky notes. It's about this thick. I still have them on my desk. And I then took those and put them into a single document and sent them over to, they kind of have a captain that was dealing with that. And I sent it over to Kerry. He's kind of the captain, whether he wanted to be or not. I think they made him the captain. But just to make sure that I captured everything that, that he felt like they had said in the meeting. And then I went from there and started working on like our past study sessions, what our survey had looked like, and also what came out of our citizens survey, and kind of came up with an idea of what I would like to see is included in our regulations. I think we do need regulations, and I sent that as an email to council. And Ms. Janelle, I will send you a copy, but I'm going to just read it into the record real fast, just so there were some people that had referenced a few things, and if you had read the packet, you're like, where are they getting that from? Well, because I had shared this with the citizens ahead of time. And so what I would like for it to look like is that they need to pay tax, must pay tax. They must have a license. It needs to be renewed after an inspection every year to keep their license. The license must be displayed in a street-facing window. Only allow 1 license per family, and they can have a second license, but only if the owner is present full-time. So that would be, you could have 2. One would be you didn't live in it, and one would be, but you did live in it, but full-time, not 51%, like that's your house that you actually live in. And on premise, full-time on premise. I would like to see that they are allowed in residential, mixed-use neighborhood, mixed-use commercial, and C1. I don't think that we should go any heavier in commercial districts, because I feel like it could turn into, I feel like that there could be some seedy stuff that happens in commercial districts where there's really not a lot of eyes on properties. And I think for some of those more like mixed-use neighborhoods, like 38th Avenue is a mixed-use neighborhood, mixed-use commercial and C1, that they can have no more than 4 units in one of those places. I think if they have more than 4 units, then they really are heading more towards a hotel. They have to be inspected. The inspection has to address, and they have to conform to all life safety issues. The fee that they pay needs to pay for staff time, or at least offset it. I don't know how much that would be. I said that I'm okay if it's a significant amount. Licenses will not be renewed if there are more than 3 nuisance complaints in a year, and they would not be renewed if there are any life safety complaints in the year, or for failure to pay taxes and fees in a timely manner. If caught operating without a license, they must stop, they must pay a significant penalty, and then have to wait 1 year to apply for a license. I do believe that the age limit should be 21 plus to rent, that they have to rent the house or single occupancy in a room, no dorm style, and that there at least has to be at least one off-street parking space required. No single night rentals allowed, it'd be a 2-night minimum. They must have their license number on their listing, must have a 24-hour emergency contact, must notify neighbors within 100 feet that they are at STR and of the emergency contact, and that they may not advertise as 420 friendly in the listing. If they say that in their welcome book, then I'm fine, but not in the listing on the Airbnb. And I'd like to look at some sort of number allowed per radius, radius per cap. And a big part of that is if you look at the map, the most little red dots that are STRs in Wheat Ridge are over in the little corner of East Wheat Ridge. Is it on that one? And so, I think that an oversaturation, that I would like to make sure we don't have an oversaturation in just one of our communities. But really, I sent all these to everybody ahead of time just because, I just wanted to, have a really direct conversation about kind of where we should go. And I know that it's not going to get completed tonight, but I really would like to, maybe not necessarily get super in the weeds, but to give staff some direction on how to move forward. And, and then we'll be able to just keep working it down the road. Thank you.
Mr. Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have some comments here, and like any good farmer, I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse, and that doesn't work. Everything that was being directed at us tonight is assuming that we're going to have STRs in the city. I mean, like, there's no question. And my question is, the first thing we have to decide on is, are we going to allow them in the city? That really has never been absolutely decided on yet. Some of the one, are you supportive of allowing short-term rentals in all zones, was 50-50 kind of, as far as being supportive and opposed. But when you take a look at the NRS 2, and we had a question about ADUs, and I quote, many residents express support for ADUs if they were limited for use by a family member, elderly parent, disabled family member, boomerang kid, etc., but not for a long-term rental by a non-family member. And we start getting into that NIMBY of not in my backyard. They're kind of, yeah, it's okay if someone has an ADU, and these are really just short-term ADUs. But they were not for having them for non-family members. And I think there is still a lot of room for discussion yet on whether we should be allowing these in the first place or not. I found it interesting that one of our speakers tonight said that they put down strict rules on what their tenants can do in their Airbnb. We have some rules in this city, but they don't seem to matter. And I believe that the first thing we need to do before we even get into all these lists of licensing and this and that is, are we going to allow our residences, our neighborhoods, to become motel districts? Because if that's the case, then we ought to change the designation to M1 so that people coming and buying what they think is a single-family house in a single-family neighborhood, that it's really a motel district. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional discussion? Mr. Urban.
Thank you very much. So before I get into this discussion, at some point I want to get clarification from the city attorney relative to this particular subject and how we approached it with using this survey and understanding that, because this is the first time that we've used a survey of council members anonymously to kind of understand where everybody's at. And I appreciate that, and I want to be able to figure out ways that we can do things like that, but I'm also concerned about some of the open meeting requirements, and when we're coming to a consensus and sort of understanding where everybody is in an anonymous survey, I just have a few questions. I'm just going to put that in the parking lot. But as far as short-term rentals, some of my concerns have been with respect to the occupancy standards, and so I guess that would be my first question. In a normal situation with a single-family residence, do we have we have a definition of family in the code, but do we have a hard number of how many people can be in a bedroom, or how many people can be, residing or having a party at a house, or?
It's a complicated matter. If you're a family, if you define yourself as a traditional family, which could be multi-generational, you're allowed to occupy a house subject to building code maximum occupancy levels. Those aren't terribly limiting. I can't quote them verbatim, but it's something to the order of, if you have a 100 square foot bedroom, you can have 2 people in them, but if you want to have 3 people in a bedroom, you need to have 140 square feet or something like that. So those aren't terribly limiting. And the other way we define a family is that it can be 2 persons that essentially define themselves as a family, and then they can have a third unrelated party. So you can have 3 kind of unrelated people living together and define themselves as a family. We also allow the renting of rooms to not more than 2 persons. So it's complicated from an enforcement standpoint. There's also certain protections under the federal fair housing laws for people that occupy a housing unit as a group home, which has come up and is on your future agenda item as well. So essentially, that is for any kind of protected class under the ADA. There's no limit on the maximum number of people in that instance that would define themselves as a family. As it pertains to short-term rentals and perhaps what was described tonight relative to the bunk rooms, I think some of the building code requirements could kick in those instances.
And then specific to, because I'm not going to bring this subject into this, but as it relates to owner-occupied, we're also going to be dealing with situations of accessory dwelling units or potentially illegal duplexes. And so if we have this requirement of owner-occupied or on-site, how does that intersect with ADUs, or are they just sort of residing in the same space without any barrier or what have you? Or is there any thought or discussion around the owner-occupant being there but it being in a separate unit?
Well, we don't allow ADUs, and I try and consistently say that. So when we identify a secondary dwelling unit on a lot that's not zoned for a second dwelling unit, whether that be a duplex or an accessory structure or basement finish, we look at the balance of the facts as to when and how that unit came into existence. And based on that, our default position is, unless they can really demonstrate that it's a legal unit, that they went through the proper channels, whether that be getting it permitted, hopefully, that it predated city's incorporation. But otherwise, the default position is if they have a second unit that doesn't appear that it was created in any legal way, then it's not a legal unit.
Okay. And that is one of my concerns as well, is that we do require that a owner be on site and that it be owner occupied, not tenant occupied, as far as a long-term renter than renting out the property. And the biggest draw for Airbnb in general is the neighborhood that the house is in. Yes, the house is great, the place they're staying is great, but if that was out in the middle of woods or if that was in the middle of a desert, it wouldn't have the same attraction as it has being in an area with a lot of amenities and streets to get to and from, and all those are costs that our neighbors are paying for in the form of taxes. And so if we're taking a perspective here, in my mind, it has to be from the people who are there all the time dealing with the situation. And there are a lot of great Airbnb owners that came in and spoke tonight, and I think that from what they're telling us, it sounds like they're doing it great. But as a former regulator, I know that rules are not written for those that are doing well and doing things the right way. It's written for those that are trying to skirt the laws or who are sort of upsetting the apple cart in the neighborhood. That's where regulation is. It isn't to keep the good guys doing good, it's to keep the bad guys from doing bad. So, and it's not to say anybody doing short-term rentals is bad, it's just understanding that that they are benefiting and receiving compensation from the environment that is their neighborhood, and their neighbors aren't getting a dime from that. So that's my main concern, and I would also ask that we not allow it in R1 neighborhoods.
Additional discussion? Ms. Davis?
So, as Ken had said earlier, I think this is going to be a long, I hate for it to be a long process because it's been ongoing forever. But I do think that there's a lot of consideration. I think there was some good feedback tonight. I think from folks that have Airbnbs and also folks that live across the street from Airbnbs, there was that willingness to compromise and work on this. But I do think there are, I think if it were to be allowed, we do need to do something about it and set something up so that it doesn't go awry, and start working on the regulations and the expectations, so that we don't end up with many, many more, and then we say, hey, we decided not to do it. So I think we either decide to do it or not to do it and move forward with the regulations. I will say, looking at my neighborhood, I could drive around and tell you which houses are also long-term rentals. And I know this is an aside and not a part of this, but I think it still needs to be a part of it because some of the comments that I heard tonight also included this is a business, and if a business is moving in across the street, well, I would say the same thing for a long-term rental. That's a business as well. So if we're going to do business licensing and that type of thing for a short-term rental, then I would like to see that be a tier of long-term rentals as well. And I know that's not tonight's discussion, but I think it needs to be a part of it because, again, in my neighborhood, those are the biggest eyesores and the biggest problems. And I can tell you we have one short-term rental, and, there's a couple, parking issues people aren't used to. And in my neighborhood, nobody likes anybody to park on the street, so that is faux pas. So if you ever see somebody do it, they catch it. But again, it's one car on a huge street. So, but we're picky. So I think that along with the short-term rental discussion, I do think licensing and some of the life safety issues and those types of things need to be considered for the long-term rentals as well. So again, I think it's a big chunk that the next council has to deal with. But I think it needs to be dealt with and decided.
Thank you. Mr. Pond?
Thank you. And thanks for everyone who came out and spoke. I may have been accused in the past of kind of rolling my eyes when someone says they've lived here all their life. But Adam came up tonight and said he lived here all of his life, and I appreciate that very much. It did not roll my eyes at all. So thank you, Adam, for coming up tonight.
Progress.
That's right. I'm making progress. Yeah. Yes. So is our city. So wonderful. I just want to say I really encourage the continuation of the conversation. I think a lot of good points have been brought up along the way. People talking about it in our comments, I think, very valid, and then some of the comments already here from council. I generally agree with the framework that Councilmember Hoppe put forward, and I think it covers a lot of ground and hits, like she mentioned, I think a lot of the conversations that we've been spending time on. So just to use that as a framework, I agree with advancing a conversation about how to regulate short-term rentals and seeing if in that conversation and using many of these points, taxation, licensure, inspection, understanding the impact of staff and an ongoing budget. And there's a lot to figure out in all of that, by the way, right? I mean, who's going to create these life safety standards, and then how will those be enforced and inspected? And so I think we shouldn't take any of that lightly. But I'm going to come back to this framework and say I support those items as a framework to start to test those things and have that conversation. The one thing, and I be interested in other people's thoughts on it. I think the radius concept is was one that I didn't necessarily either. I don't know if I don't agree with it. I'm not sure how it could be executed. I think I understand the intention and the reference to some of the densities in other areas. So I'm not. Again, I suppose it's just something that I'll be interested to see how the conversation develops. So I'm not being super specific, in here other than to say I think that the framework that Councilmember Hoppe has put together, I think advances the conversation one more step, and I support it, advancing that, and hope that that you guys will continue to talk about it.
Thank you, Mr. Keeter.
I guess following up on that, but also maybe to try to bring a little structure to the discussion tonight. I guess, first of all, I agree with Mr. Matthews, but from the other side, where it seems like we should answer the threshold question. Are we going to set up a regulatory scheme that permits short-term rentals in Wheat Ridge? And then if the answer to that is yes, then perhaps we could go, almost like we did with the building codes, go line by line through the structure just to get as opposed to kind of everybody putting their 2 cents on each part of it, one at a time, that we just go through one at a time the list. And I'm assuming that if the answer to the threshold question is yes, there are probably some of these, like licensing and taxing, that probably aren't going to take a lot of discussion to get to at least some level of consensus on. So without wanting to shut off discussion on the larger question, I guess I would be willing to ask for a consensus that we move forward with a regulatory framework that will permit short-term rentals.
Hold on, I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please, Mr. Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So on that issue, the question you pose is whether or not we're going to allow short-term rentals, and we have a fairly, not lengthy, but a decent chunk in code regarding bed and breakfast, and there's quite a bit of requirements in there, and it does mirror what the Air Bed and Breakfast Company does. So I would say we already have one, and so my concern here is as we go forward with asking whether we should or should not allow short-term rentals, what does that do, and how is that uniquely different from this code? So are we going to strip this out of the code and replace it with short-term rentals? Or are we going to leave Airbnbs to sit aside our licensing of massage parlors to do nothing? Because we don't license that, we don't license massage parlors, we don't license bed and breakfast, but they're in our code. So are we just going to take those out or leave them in there as sort of relics? Or and that kind of goes back to the question is that they're currently not allowed. So the question's already be asked and answered. Are they allowed? No, they're not. So the question is, are we going to go forward with that? And I'm okay with that, but I'm concerned about, we already have codes in here, and are we just going to set that aside and pretend that they don't exist? Or
And Mr. Johnstone, I'm assuming that short-term rentals don't qualify under a bed and breakfast definition that exists in the code?
I think it's just a different model, right? So we do allow bed and breakfasts in all of our residential zone districts. There's minimum lot size requirements, there's minimum parking requirements. They're described, and there's a maximum number of rooms. You can have more rooms if you have a bigger lot. That's the general framework. They require special use permit, which, like all special use permits, are reviewed and potentially approved administratively. If there are neighborhood objections or under a couple of other scenarios, if I deny it or if they don't like the conditions that the community development director would impose, they can appeal those to city council. So there'd be a public hearing in front of city council. I think that's a little different business, and in my experience with bed and breakfast, though it's not mandatory, is that they typically provide other services, right? So people that are coming to breakfast, maybe a happy hour at the end of the day, maybe a common game room, but they're a little different business model than in my experience with Airbnb. So I think there remains a valid distinction. If you choose to regulate short-term rentals and do so in a manner that kind of firms up those distinctions. Should we look at them? absolutely, we want to make sure that if you choose to regulate short-term rentals, that those are aligning well with what we can commonly agree to as a typical model for a bed and breakfast.
Going to go to Ms. Weaver right now.
I agree with what has been said about are we going to go forward with short-term rentals. My concern about that is that if we don't acknowledge what's happening, I mean, you heard some of the statistics tonight about half of the Airbnbs in Denver don't have a license, and they continue to operate, and it's a logistical nightmare to try and crack down on every one of those Airbnbs that's outside of that. And for me, and I'm going to speak as I have been an Airbnb host before on another property I own. I just think we have to look at what is happening, and I feel like I want us to acknowledge and move forward, and I think it's worth us spending the resource time to really solve this because people are really frustrated. Both Airbnb hosts about sort of the future of it, and current people that are frustrated with parking and all of these different issues that we've heard. I do think that I really like the list that you came up with. I would add a few things. I do think we need to deal with occupancy limit, which I'd like to come back to in a second, because I think there are some things on the systems like VRBO and Airbnb do offer that cuts out a large amount of some of the issues that we're talking about. But first I would add the list that there not only be an emergency contact, but that contact live within 30 miles and be able to be at the property within an hour. Because that seems to, I just found that was something that the county, Grand County, where I rented, was a Airbnb host. That was what they required. I couldn't live in Denver and be the emergency contact. I actually had to pay another manager who could be at the property within an hour or whatever it was. The occupancy piece, I think, because there's three types of rental in generally three types. There's couch surfing, and I think all of us, well, I can't speak for all of us, but I feel like that's something we're all feeling yucky about, that maybe couch surfing is not okay. That's literally in Airbnb, you can get a bed, okay? Whether that bed's in a living room or whatever. That's going to be a certain type of clientele that wants that. And we can say, no couch surfing. We're not doing that. You have to have a room to actually rent. And we can set up occupancy requirements. We can do all those things per building codes. But I think you can also set up limits on, and this could be per the license, where maybe it is more like the actual bed and breakfast regulation, where our planning is looking at the amount of rooms and saying, per the license, yes, you can do this, no, you can do this, you can't do this. You can have a queen-size bed in this room, and no more than 2 people can be in that room. I think we can do that, and I think just by the nature of the kinds of things that we're talking about, there are different types of hosts on Airbnb, and for those of us who use Airbnb as our hotel of choice, there are certain properties I think someone said they only rent an entire place. That's how I feel. I only rent an entire place, and I don't want to be down the hall from somebody else. I don't want multiple room renting. That's also something we could say is no more than 1 room being rented. So I think the framework that Ms. Hoppe has put out there is a really, really good start. And we figure out, it's highly restrictive. I think it's probably great to start highly restrictive. And then if we find that we're redundant on some of these things, but I do think we need to put things in place now. Because by simply saying that we don't allow them, which is what we say right now, we don't have the person power to go out and enforce that. Unless we want to spend a lot of money on sending people door to door to every one of these establishments. In which case, it's whack-a-mole, because it's a thing, and people do this, and they really like it, and for lots of reasons that we heard. And there's another side of it that I think we can truly regulate out a lot of the issues. And then the last thing I wanted to say, per the notifying people, that's one thing that good hosts do, is notify all of the neighbors, give them an emergency contact, and they say, hey, please call me if there are issues, if they're not an on-site host. I think there's ways that we can, either it's a notice coming out from the city, or again, it's part of this licensing of, you have to notify all of the owners around you and give them an emergency contact and explain, so they know what their rights are as well, as far as, it's really upsetting to hear of the parties and the having to look across the street, and unfortunately I have to do that with long-term rentals in my neighborhood. So there's no regulation for that, but thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Dozman.
I was just going to ask Mr. Johnstone if we plan to do a framework of like minimum lot sizes and like that occupancy per square footage would be built into it.
Well, I think we'll take your direction, but I think in terms of a minimum lot size, we hadn't necessarily thought about that, but it's certainly something you could do. I think the occupancy that's in the building code, unless you decide not to enforce that would definitely be part of this and would be, determined as part of that licensing and inspection process, that we could really have a clear delineation of calculating what the number is that you can put in that room.
Thank you. Mr. Keeter?
Take another shot at asking the threshold consensus question of, do we, subject to the regulatory framework that we work out, do we want to permit short-term rentals in the city of Wheat Ridge?
We do have consensus on that.
And then I guess my thought was to work through the list. I was in communication with Ms. Hoppy about the list, but it really is her work primarily, and so I don't want to usurp her if she wants to walk through the points and explain her rationales, and we can
Ms. Hoppy?
vote.
From what I've heard, I think there's probably only really one main thing that we need to establish in the beginning before we go, and that is, and so I'm going to ask for a consensus to allow both non-occupied Airbnbs and for owner-occupied Airbnbs, meaning that the non-occupied Airbnbs is something where you would rent the whole home, and the person who owns the property does not live there. And then the owner-occupied means you're renting a room and they are living also in the house in another room. So I'm going to ask for consensus that we allow both of those types, and then I think we can move from there.
Question, Ms. Davis?
So I just have a quick question based off of the map and the little dots. So here it says, okay, so I see the Airbnbs, which is the lion's share of them. But then, I think second in line is the Expedia owned. And so is that literally Expedia owned? So does Expedia, the company Expedia, own those and rent those? It's not that they're managed by them and owned by somebody else or something like that. They are, quote unquote, Expedia owned.
That's my understanding.
So like in this situation where Ms. Hoppy was speaking, which I'm all for, is that like those ones, would need to go away?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, yes, they would under how she's couched it.
Yeah.
I hear, and here's something that that happened to me in Santa Fe, New Mexico, is that I go to Santa Fe and we stayed in an Airbnb, and there was a company who owned all of these houses around us, and they were all Airbnbs. And so I don't think that it's that's why I was saying, like, you can only have 2 licenses, one that's where you are off premise and one where you are on premise, to eliminate that type of thing to happen. Now, does that mean that my property that I own on 38th Avenue is under Molly Marie Properties LLC, right? So does that mean that an LLC couldn't own it? Not necessarily, but Molly Marie Properties, well, I have long-term rentals anyways, I wouldn't do this. But, but would that mean that an LLC couldn't own a property? And the way I see it, as long as they're following the regulations of, you only get 2 licenses, and if you're living in one of those properties and they're owned under an LLC, sometimes family partnerships own properties and stuff like that.
Okay, but I was kind of more going, I understand that.
Yeah.
But basically what you were saying is, regardless, if you're Expedia, if you're Davis Enterprises, if you're whatever, 2.
That's it.
And you live in one of them.
Yep.
Right, so I feel like that the intention behind that is so that, developers or investors don't come in and buy up multiple properties.
Right,
and
I
have them all as
understand. It's like
Airbnbs, yeah.
Expedia.
Right, exactly.
Mr. Bond?
For clarity, your consensus question is a little bit different. So I agree with the statement that's here, which is maxing it out at 2, 1 lived in. Your consensus question, just to restate it, is do we agree with both types? And my answer, and I will vote for this, is yes, but largely within the constraints that I'm seeing right here.
And Ms. Weaver, did you have a comment?
I just would like a clarification. If I own 4 homes and 2 of them are in long-term rental, and that means that I could, and I live in one, I can have one of those 4 be not owner-occupied short-term rental, but I could still have 2 long-term rentals. So I just want to make sure with some of the situations we heard tonight that we're not creating.
Or run a bed and breakfast.
And then I had a question then, if you had that scenario and you formed a new LLC and purchased a home, would you be able to buy more homes and run Airbnbs?
No, I mean, we would definitely have to look at the application process, but it's going to have somebody's name on it. And so, like, I wouldn't have a license under Janice Hoppy, Olivia Hoppy, and Nathan Hoppy, because that's, we're one family. We get to have one of each type as one family.
Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Along those same lines, and I don't want to pepper you with all these questions, but if I don't want to use my primary residence as an Airbnb, but I have a second property in Wheat Ridge, can I just apply for a non-owner occupied Airbnb for that property so long as I reside within the city, or do I have to apply for a short-term rental for my primary residence?
The way I see it is, if you want a second license, you have to, like, you can apply for any license for your one Airbnb that you don't live in. But if you want a second license, you have to live in it. Or you could have just a license where you live in it, and then if you end up acquiring another property, then you could get one for a non-owner occupied.
Do you think that would the title of the property then be in the identical name? Is that what you're thinking about? Is that you say that the home that you own, you live there, and you have the right to have an Airbnb, and then if you have another property that you could have an Airbnb, whether you have one in your home, would the title on those two pieces of real estate need to be titled the same?
I wouldn't think they would have to, but if you're the owner operator of the Airbnb, then if my brother owned a home and then he moved out of state or something and I was going to Airbnb his home, and then plus I already have my license for my owner occupied one, then if I'm running that out of, you know what, I don't, David's got his hand up. I don't.
Only in a broader, to the rescue. Only in the broader sense, there's going to have to be some level of piercing the corporate veil, because to prevent somebody from setting up 18 LLCs and getting licensed underneath. So I don't know whether the city has whether there are other areas like liquor licensing or such where there are limits on the number of licenses that somebody can
I don't know.
hold.
I mean, I think this is all same kind of questions that I had in terms of how do we enforce that. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be something we have to work really carefully with the city attorney's office and see how we can, meet the intent of, if there's consensus, which it sounds like there might be, well, we'll see. They will have to work hard on that because it's not going to be easy. And ultimately, our mindset that we'll be thinking about all this is how easy or hard is it going to be to enforce that in a court of law? Because that's where this stuff is going to end up, right? So the people that don't want to play nice, we're going to end up in a court of law. Right. And this needs to be tight enough that we can get a conviction, essentially.
So we'll let Jerry figure it out.
Mr. Urban.
A conviction or a resolution, certainly. I think I would be okay with an owner-occupant having a license and thereby, by having that license, has the opportunity within the city to own and operate another non-owner occupied Airbnb. And just those two, what I'm concerned about is flipping that around and saying anybody can have any non-owner occupied Airbnb in the city, and that's what concerns me, is that I want to make sure that this is treated like a bed and breakfast. If we think that we have all these people coming in from around the world, which apparently we do, wouldn't we want our residents to be their tour guide and help them see what's going on? When I see these corporate entities out there doing this, I've got no problems with their corporate structure, but it doesn't seem very attached to the neighborhood and doesn't give us our best foot forward as a city. And so by making sure that we have owner-occupied Airbnbs or short-term rentals, as it were, it ensures that we have the best tour guide available to showcase our city, and that, I think, is a good way forward. I don't want non-owner occupied short-term rentals in our neighborhoods.
Ms. Hoppy?
Okay, so I'm, and I hear what Councilmember Urban is saying, but I've also talked to a bunch of different residents, and all the way from no, we don't want anything to, if I wanted to, buy these several houses in a row, I should be able to do them all. So trying to find something in the middle, in that's kind of the work. But, and I would say I wouldn't stay in one, well, I have stayed in one that was home share, where the owner occupied, and I've stayed in them where the owner didn't occupy. And I think that the situations were different. So my needs were different in those two situations. And so that's why I think that we should allow both. But the consensus that I'm trying to reach is just very clearly, and it's not about the limits or anything yet. It's just about, do we want to allow both types, owner-occupied and non-owner occupied? And so that's the consensus that I wanted to start with before then we move forward to like the have a license, don't have a license, that kind of. So my consensus is, do we want to allow occupied and non-occupied Airbnbs in our community?
You need to, so that's to allow.
I'm asking for a consensus to ask, to allow both types. And the next step then will be, the limit is 2, right? So, but to be able to say the limit is 2, we have to know that there's consensus to allow both types. So is there consensus to allow both types? Okay.
Okay, there's consensus.
Then my next consensus question would be,
Well, before you go to that, Mr.
Okay.
Urban had a,
Oh, sorry.
I guess, as it stands right now, our bed and breakfast code says that the owner, it must be owner occupied. So if we are allowing non-owner occupied properties, I feel much more comfortable if that fell under the, our current bed and breakfast code that requires a special use permit for non-owner occupied, because we can sit here and come up with all the permutations we want, but it's until someone comes up with the one permutation we didn't come up with that we don't have the ability to have any say over whatsoever, or some, something down the line that this evolves into. We're throwing around Airbnb a lot, but that's one of 100 different companies that do this, and so I just want to make sure that as it relates to non-owner occupied businesses that are operating in residential areas, that either the city or the neighborhood has a chance to pipe in on that, because it is it's a unique and foreign use that it isn't being done in the other parts of the neighborhood. So I would just caution us about this non-owner occupied part.
Ms. Weaver?
Just to address that, I think we're opening up a really big can of worms. I agree with you. However, I think then we're sort of saying, if we're going to require a license for one, but then a special use permit for owner-occupied, then I would sort of come back and say, well, what about long-term rentals? Because I'd love to see special use permit for long-term rentals. And I think then it's now we're comparing two different kinds of short-term and long-term rental for non-owner occupied. And if we're going to address one, then I definitely say we also have to address the other.
Mr. Matthews?
I'd like the record to show that Councilman Matthews voted no on all of the above and all the following. There is a question that one of my constituents brought up, though, and how is this going to work with HOAs? Can they supersede or overrule our codes if they have an HOA in an area that says no Airbnbs? And do we allow for them to be able to enforce that?
Mr. Johnstone, what's the relationship in the hierarchy of?
My HOA doesn't allow them, so unless that's not legal, I assume we had our attorney say they're not allowed.
Mr. Keeter?
So just a very quick question on the proposed consensus based on a case study from somebody that spoke tonight. So the gentleman who lives in Boulder, who has a non-owner occupied Airbnb in Wheat Ridge, that's his one license and he can have that. In order to have a second Airbnb in Wheat Ridge, it would have to be owner occupied.
Ms. Hoppy?
So then, yes, getting into the weeds of that consensus. And to be honest, I don't think we need to go down the whole list. I'm just bringing up the few things that I heard that are hot. Yeah, and then if there's anything that I don't bring up, then somebody else feel free to bring it up. But, so now that we have consensus to allow both types, do we have consensus to allow only 2 licenses total? Per person, per family, per. No, per family, like I said, my family, I wouldn't get 2 for me, 2 for Olivia, and 2 for Nathan, but per family. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in concept.
Sort of per property owner? I mean, is that?
I mean, we can talk to Jerry Dahl and we can look at the application process, but in general, 2.
The 2 presupposes the answer to some of that question, because if Janice tried to register all of her family, they're all residing in one unit, so that wouldn't comply with the 1 and 1. It would actually have to be people living in different units that would get the license and would be able to have 2. Otherwise, you just get the 1.
Yeah. So, and also knowing that our consensus is to give staff direction to move forward too. So this isn't, we're not carving this in stone tonight. Yeah. So 2, a total of 2.
Limit of 2, consensus there.
And then the next thing that I heard is for staff to come to us with some sort of occupancy caps or standards, to make sure that we're meeting some correct occupancies, reasonable occupancies. We have other things in the list that would keep dorm style out, but just to make sure that we have backups to keep dorm style out. So are we supportive of occupancy, staff coming up with occupancy staff to bring towards us?
Looks like we had a couple of questions. Ms. Davis, do you have a question?
I had a question about dorm style. Like, what do you mean by that? So, do you mean, like, so if I'm one person, I have 4 other bedrooms in my house, can I rent out all those bedrooms? Or is that your kind of thing of dorm style? So I could rent it to, because I think I read that in your email, where I could, or maybe I read it, I can rent it to 4 different people, or I can rent it once to like a family that needs 4 rooms.
So the way I was thinking about it is that it would be single occupancy in a room. So if that means my husband and I and my kiddo on a pull-out couch in that room, but that's a single occupancy in that room. What it doesn't mean is me and 3 people that I've never met off of the street in the same room in bunk beds.
But you're still saying, when you say single occupancy, that's a good clarification, because to me, I was thinking one person, maybe a couple. I wasn't thinking a couple and children in the same room. So you're thinking single occupancy could be a family in one room.
With perhaps another family in another room and another family in another room, and with no limit on the number of occupants?
Well, that's why my consensus was to ask staff to come up with occupancy cap suggestions. Yeah. So do we have a consensus to ask staff?
A question by Ms. Weaver.
I'd just like to make a comment on this. I think we should also clarify that we're not renting beds, because that's one of the big things on these sites, is renting a bed versus renting a room versus renting a house. And I don't think there should be bed rental. I agreed with the person who said that's gross. The other thing is the occupancy, I think, in a lot of these sites is dictated by the type of bed in the room. So if it's a queen-size bed, the occupancy is no more than 2. So I think there's already some, you have to, we've already said you have to have a room, and the number of beds in that room may allow the number of people. Now, the question is a bunk room, what if I put 3 bunk beds in a big room? I would say that's not okay. That's dorm style. Just thoughts.
Should we be talking about, restroom facilities and kitchen facilities and things like that, that make it feasible? I don't know how to work that into the conversation, but, to have sort of a rooming house that, it's got 4 bedrooms and a bathroom down the hall. It's very different than sort of renting the house. But Ms. Hoppy?
In the email that I sent out, it says, that there will have to be an inspection. It has to address life safety issues. In life safety issues, they look at things like points of egress. Is there running water? Is there bathrooms? Is there, a working kitchen? Do you have smoke detectors, CO2s, stuff like that? So that stuff would all kind of get flushed out in the inspection, although the inspection process will have to get flushed out a little bit more. But, again, I wasn't trying to get us super into the weeds with every tiny detail, just more like getting us down the road. So, because the thing is, we can get in the weeds with every tiny detail for another 10 or 15 meetings. But if we can get the staff some direction to move the ball down the road, then I think that that's what we should be trying to do.
Mr. Urban?
I guess on the issue of life safety issues and the inspection, as we're doing that, then we're telling all guests that come to the city of Wheat Ridge that property is safe and is healthy for you. And I'm curious as it relates to any other activities or our ability to do that and provide a decent level of assurance that what has been inspected is the case. And I get it's sort of a point-in-time situation where you look at it at one point and the batteries are in the smoke detector and everything's good, and then somebody stays there and it's beeping, they take the batteries out and owner doesn't know it, and then there is no smoke detector for the next guy. So as it relates to life, safety, and health issues, what experience do we have in running that kind of program or being able to enforce that adequately to say that we're doing it? Do we have anything like that, or?
I mean, I think it's always going to be a point in time unless we have a complaint that, and how we process complaints in terms of doing a reinspection, you know, what kind of level of proof do we need? But I think the example would be two. One is the ongoing hotel motel inspection where we get in every hotel room once a year. But we certainly can't guarantee that the conditions that we observed or the conditions that we required them to improve it to as a result of the inspection are going to maintain themselves for the next year. And then, of course, we had a pilot program for multifamily inspection program many years ago where we got into a number of rooms and enforced the International Property Maintenance Code. And again, that was a point in time, so that it certainly wouldn't guarantee that that would be maintained for whatever period of time.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as it relates to the fire department and other entities that may be impacted by this, has there been any discussion or input provided by the fire department relative to this, or do they have any concerns or other involvement with respect to short-term rentals?
We've not talked with them. I would just note that they are an active participant in the hotel motel inspection program, so they've been willing to do that, but this would be another potential task for them. I'm not sure what if they'd have the same level of interest as they do in the hotel motels or not.
Okay, thank you. Oh wait, sorry. The item in here about complaints, so can I call on someone 3 days in a row or 3 times in a day and then it's done, or do these have to be substantiated claims, and how do we identify a good complaint versus a bogus complaint? Because hearing the folks tonight, they'll all call tomorrow and it's done. So I need to know that there's some kind of process to say this was a verified, and I don't even know how to do that. But so if someone's having a party and the cops show up and everybody's quiet, then is that a valid complaint? Not that I've ever done that, but is that
something to consider? Ms. Hoppy.
Yeah, I guess I would say, and we do have a process to handle complaints already in the city, and it's like, I think that it's like they can get a warning, and then if they don't fix it, then they end up having to go to a hearing of some sort. And I don't know if it's like and then the Board of Adjustment, if they then look at these, but I mean, we do have already a process for complaints. I would say a complaint would be something that would have to be substantiated, and, if the complaint is, there's a bunch of trash all over and it's not getting cleaned up, and then they don't clean it up again, then, then they end up in their hearing in that process. However, we could look at, we could look at what consists of a complaint. How is a complaint just a phone call, or is it a complaint that they have to actually get ticketed? And that's something that we could, look at in detail at further on down the road.
Ms. Dozman?
Yeah, so I would kind of err on the side of like a citation notice as opposed to just a complaint, because then that shows a habit of neglect and non-compliance. All right, awesome, thank you.
So then the consensus that I've been trying to get to is, do we want to allow staff to come to us with occupancy suggested totals?
Yes.
Yeah, occupancy total, yeah, okay. And then addressing Mr. Urban and Ms. Dozman's concern about complaints and changing the complaints to citations, and looking at a process for that. And then, is there anything else that anyone would like to have a discussion about or removed that was on the list before I asked to move forward the rest of the list?
Ms. Weaver?
Sorry, I would like to add that the emergency contact either, I don't know what's appropriate, either lives within 30 miles of the property or has to be able to get to the property within an hour. Because like in Grand County, they wouldn't allow me to be in Denver, even though I could get up there very fast. They were like, no, it has to be you have to live within, I think it was 40 miles.
Well, you might make it to the top of the pass and get into the county line, but
Well, you don't know how I
you're not
drive,
going to
but
get
yeah.
down the other side.
So do we have consensus then for Amanda's?
Okay, we do. Ms. Davis?
I think the other thing kind of goes back to what Mr. Pond was saying. I agree with monitoring how many, but I guess I'm not sure how we're going to do that, and how is it allowed that so-and-so can do it across the street, and, is it like a first come, first served basis, or, if I have one in my backyard, does that mean I can't have one even though I'm on a different street? So I think that one, I say, hey, all the power to you. Hopefully you can figure it out. But I think that would be tough, especially now when you look at all those dots. Like, how do you say, I know like somebody on the dais or on the podium today asked, well, can I be grandfathered in? So I think I hear what you're saying, and I think it makes sense that we don't want everybody on the street to be it. But I guess my question would be, that's a tough one.
Ms. Hoppy?
Yeah, and actually, I've had a couple of discussions around that with some people, and it is tough because basically we have to come up with a priority system, right? Who gets priority? And that's a discussion that we'll have to have. Like, is it who owned the property, who's owned their property the longest? Do they get priority? Is it, who's been on the listings, who can show that they've been doing it the longest gets priority? Is it, so that's the hard part, is it is going to be hard to figure out who gets priority, to be able to only have a certain number of them within a certain radius of each other, if we're like looking at like caps and stuff like that. But, like I said, for District 1 specifically, I think radius, buffer zones, and caps are pretty important, because if you look at the map, we have a huge saturation in our little east corner. And so I understand that it probably isn't even that big of a deal in other districts, but, it's going to be something that we're going to have to look at. And I don't have I need more conversations with people around that to figure that out.
Mr. Urban?
I think along those lines, if this was just one entity that was providing the short-term rental opportunities to folks, it would be we'd be able to better interface with that particular entity to work on some of these issues. But when we have an untold number of entities providing this type of service, whether it's Airbnb or somebody else, I think that's where the caps come into place, because the whole benefit of staying in one of these is to be in that particular neighborhood. And if everybody is an Airbnb, then it's like a Disneyland, where it's just sort of a facade. It's not real Wheat Ridge. And I think we should take great compliment to the fact that it appears Expedia and Priceline and those are buying up what is Wheat Ridge. But if they buy up too much of it, then it is no longer Wheat Ridge. It's a facade of what it is. So that's what my main concern is, and why I would support caps. And if it's a lottery system or what have you, I don't see a problem with that. I just want to make sure that we don't have a situation where we have Airbnb row and there's every one of them on either side is different companies that own them from out of state. I can't see that happening, and I would say that would be to their detriment as well, because it is part of the attraction to these Airbnbs is the neighborhood. So the neighborhood has to be respected, and we need to create a buffer. And to the point of, well, it's not fair to everybody else. Well, it's not fair to any other marijuana dispensary that we only allow 5, and that's just what we require.
Ms. Weaver?
I was just going to say, Airbnb is also very aware of this problem, because it is hurting their business, because people do this. initially started as this sort of person-to-person kind of connection. And I think as more travelers are starting to report that of, I ended up going to this just neighborhood of Airbnbs. So I think we're also going to see a response from the industry about this very problem. So,
Ms. Dozman.
So I don't necessarily need to put a dollar amount on it this evening, but I also have some questions about licensing costs and fees and whether that's going to mirror what we already have as far as like lodging and hotel taxes, whether it's going to be an annual fee and there's going to be like an annual registration along with the inspection and maintenance of that, and whether fees are going to go towards staff resources and how we're going to allocate that money as well. So I just definitely want that to be a part of the conversation and what comes back from us or from staff to us.
Ms. Hobby?
Sure, and thanks, Ms. Dozman, and that is that is on the list from the email, and from what I read into record earlier. So now I've asked if anybody wanted to remove anything off of this. We've added a few things, and I'm just going to ask if we can move the list forward for staff to start working on. So I'd like to ask for consensus to move forward the list that was presented to you by email from me.
Question by Mr. Keeter.
Sorry, not to drag this out, but just to clarify what's in the list. So does that include a cap or geographic limit? Just we don't have a proposal at this time as to what that
Includes
number
it
is?
looking at one.
Okay.
Mhm.
And does that include your last statement of being okay looking at a total cap per district? Okay.
Okay, going to ask for consensus.
Okay, so we have consensus to move the whole sandbag. Mr. Keeter.
I have one question that I don't think was actually on the list. One of the survey questions was a grace period for existing properties to come into compliance. I'm not sure, I don't think there should be a grace period on licensing and paying taxes. That's something that everybody should be doing on day one, but at least by the survey, there seemed to be a consensus to allow existing properties to come into compliance, and so I guess then maybe I should have done this as part of the list, but I would request a consensus to add that to the list.
What was that?
A grace period, and not for licensure or paying taxes or such, but to come into compliance with other portions of the list.
So, but would that mean a situation where they couldn't qualify to begin with, but we got this grace period, so we're just going to sort of ride it out? That's my concerns. Yeah, I'm in the grace period.
I would say if we can't qualify to begin with, then we should
Probably be an Airbnb, right? I guess my question is what do you mean by compliance? So does compliance mean that I own 5, so now I got to shuffle to get 3 of my friends to put their names on my property? And I mean, so I guess I'm not sure about compliance, what you mean by compliance. And then, like, again, if we decide on some type of number radius, in a radius, how do you come into compliance with that? So I guess I'm not sure of your term compliance.
Would this be something that we might want to just sort of put to the side to understand what the regulatory scheme is, and then then it would become more apparent how we get compliance for the regulatory scheme? Does that seem to make sense?
I agree with that and either adopt that as the consensus or withdraw my request.
Would we have consensus on that scheme? Okay, we would.
Mr. Mayor, what is that consensus?
That consensus is to put to the side the time period with which people will need to come into compliance will depend upon what compliance looks like. Are there any, Mr. Urban?
I'm sorry, but I have to leave now, so.
Oh, okay, I was just going to go to Mr. Johnstone and see if with the multiple consensuses that we've had, or consensi, my Latin is not so good. Do you have the information you need to move forward?
I've got 5 pages of notes, so.
Okay. Unless there's, are there any more comments of council on this item that we need to address at this time? Then we will conclude item number 2, and we will go to staff reports. Mr. Johnstone.
None this evening, unless you're looking for any updates on anything in particular.
Okay, we will then go to elected officials reports. Do any elected officials want to talk? And we'll start with Ms. Dozman.
I would just like to invite everyone watching and everyone here to Local Works Trunk or Treat event this Saturday, October 26th. It starts at 4 p.m., ending at 6 p.m., and it's at Lutheran Hospital this year.
And do you know where at Lutheran? Are these the parking
Yeah, so
lots
it
on
says
the east side? Or?
3555 North Lutheran Parkway. So I'm guessing in the bigger parking lot. Yeah, so 355 is the building. It's not the main hospital, but the parking lot above. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any other elected officials reports? Ms. Hoppy.
Just want to remind District 1 that I will be at the Rec Center tomorrow from 6:30 to 8. We're talking about 2E, why I support it. I believe our county treasurer will be there to talk about 1A, if you'd like to hear about that one also. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you. Any other elected officials reports or business to come? Okay, then we will stand adjourned. Thank you.